Okay, I wanted to do a quick video just talking about surveys since that is the method of measurement we are using for our research study. We've talked a little bit about the survey questions and other various things in class. And you've read the chapter on surveys, I'm assuming, because there was a chapter review done or due for it. However, I just wanted to kind of do a little bit of a short lecture. I'm going to try to keep it short, um, just to kind of deepen our understanding and flesh out a couple details on research and surveys. So, apparently, my little camera guy is over top of my words, but we'll roll with it. Um, Let me see if I can move it actually. Oh, I can move it. Okay, sorry. There we go. I'm trying a new program. Anyways, I'm going to give you the down and dirty on surveys. So, what are surveys? I think we've all taken one at some point in our lives, whether it was doing a course evaluation for a professor or doing online surveys to make money. I don't know. We've all probably encountered them in some shape or form. But really, when you're doing survey research, it's intended to be quantitative. It can be qualitative in some ways, but generally, it's quantitative in nature, where the researcher poses a set of predetermined questions to a sample of individuals. So we find a population, we figure out the questions, we ask these questions and only these questions to our research population. It's really, really helpful if you're wanting to get information from a large group of people, so your population size is very large. These are really handy because you can distribute them very efficiently to people. They can take them. There's different ways you can do it in person. You can do it electronically through mail. There's different ways to implement surveys, but it tends to be very helpful when you're trying to reach a large group. And this can help explain trends or features of a large group. So you're asking them all the same questions. They have the same scale to respond with. Now, obviously, everybody might have a little bit of a different interpretation of what the scaling responses mean to them. There's a piece of subjectivity. So, like a 4 for me might look different than what a 4 is for somebody else. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But overall, it kind of gives you a good idea of trends that are happening in larger groups. And depending on how general or how specific your survey is, this could be a way to set up for a deeper, more involved research study. So maybe more explanatory versus exploratory. So our survey is going to be very exploratory. We're just exploring the attitudes and perceptions of college students. And so from those findings, we might find that so many people are concerned about finances post graduation. So this could lead to a more in-depth study of what specifically about finances are they worried about. Can we use an intervention to help prepare college students better? So that could be an explanatory, having a group given to some people and then have a control group where they don't take it and then compare the results. So very, very useful, especially at the level of research that we are conducting. All right, strengths and weaknesses of surveys. The strength definitely is cost effectiveness. So you can reach a lot of people using one survey, especially with electronic surveys. You just have to do an email. You don't have to worry about postage. You don't have to worry about mailing and finding envelopes and putting addresses and everything. A lot of programs will take the data that is answered in the surveys and they'll run the statistics for you. So that saves time and energy, perhaps paying somebody to run the statistical analysis for you. So there's a huge piece of cost effectiveness. And when thinking of the social work research field or just social work in general, it's not what we would consider maybe an overly wealthy field of social work. It's very tapped for resources at times. So within the social work field, surveys are really, really helpful because it does help save costs a little bit. The generalizability, here's your big word for the day. It can be given to a lot of different people. So obviously everybody's experience is different, but we can give the same questions to a wide variety of people with different identities, and we can get information for all of them very quickly. They're generally pretty reliable, especially when you put in like a standard scaling questions because you have the same scale for each person. Everyone's asking the same thing. There's limited room for interpretation and subjectivity in it. And they're very versatile. I mean, I feel like every discipline can really use surveys, not just social work, but every department, basically every field can use surveys. However, everything that has strengths also typically has some weaknesses. There's not a ton of weaknesses in comparison to the strengths. Some of the weaknesses is that there's a little bit of inflexibility. So if you are asking a question and a person's experiences differ from the options that they have to choose, you might not get the full picture because you have to have it stay standard for everybody. So you might lose some pieces of the picture that could potentially be helpful. You might not understand fully everyone's experiences. There's not always the option for qualitative explanations of why they chose the answer. But if your purpose is just to get quantitative data, surveys are really good. And sometimes, again, that ties into the lack of depth. You can't always fully understand a person's response because they're limited how they can respond. But again, it goes back to if we're looking for quantitative data, that does help us out in that aspect. So as you're thinking about creating a survey, I'm going to attempt to flip this again. And I'm over here now. Okay. These are just some crispy nuggets when we're thinking about creation, implementation, those types of things. We want to be aware of intentional or unintentional biases. So we can really, when we're crafting the questions, we want to stay as neutral as possible because we might put our own bias on what people should think into how we word the questions. So if you want to have swayed data to help your cause out, you might word questions in a certain way to make people think they feel a certain way, or answer in ways that would help validate your research question, your funding objectives. However, it might not be the respondent's true reality and how they actually feel. You never want to use surveys as a coercion piece. So if you fill this out and give me a 5-star rating, I'm going to give you an A in your class. Like some places will be like, give us a 5-star review on Google and you'll get a gift card. And so those who want gift cards are going to then be like, yes, I'm absolutely going to give you a 5-star rating. And then people who are looking at that service later down the road see all these 5 stars and think it's great. Well, it might only be great because someone got an incentive for filling out the survey. So you do have to be mindful of that. You also have to be mindful, and I think this generally comes through electronic surveys. Not everybody has access to technology or the resources necessary to complete surveys online. And so we're missing out on those voices if we're only having those respondents be ones who have access to that technology. So that could be looked at as a piece of discrimination in some ways. That's not very equitable for everybody. So you just have to be mindful of that. And also being aware of sometimes the influence of often people who are motivated or super engaged or super passionate about a certain topic are more willing to fill out the survey. So it might be skewed a little bit because you have the highly motivated individual to respond. You want to make sure to capture everyone's voices. I often think about this with when you have to do evaluations and surveys for your courses. Oftentimes highly motivated, super engaged students who really enjoyed the class will fill out the surveys, and that might skew it a little bit because yes, they had a wonderful experience. Or you have the people who really hated the class, are pissed off at the professor, and they want to burn them at the stake in their survey. So they're motivated to unleash their anger through the use of the survey and evaluation. And we kind of miss out on the voices of those who kind of fall in the middle of the road. So you just have to have that lens on when you're administering surveys and kind of just thinking about that. Where might we have intentional biases that we need to eliminate, and how can we also eliminate those unintentional biases? When you're starting to create your surveys, you always want to start brainstorming questions and consulting literature before you make the survey questions. We talked about this in class, how the literature review is intended to be helpful to point out themes in literature and research that people have already identified as being a concern or an area worth exploring in regards to our population. And then that can help craft us our questions. It's always really helpful to get feedback before you distribute the survey because, and this can happen sometimes as you get more into the field of social work, we are aware of certain language that's very common in social work, or even think about like medical professionals, certain terminology might not be known or understandable to the general population. And so it's helpful to get someone who is a little bit more removed from your research project to kind of take it, to eyeball it, just to get that outside perspective, to make sure that the questions you're asking actually are asking what you want to be asked, not what you think is being asked. Hopefully that wasn't confusing. Because we know our intentions, we know what we're hoping to achieve, but how we word it or how we craft a question might be confusing to someone who isn't as close to the topic. So really, really helpful to get an objective perspective on that. You want to organize your questions well. Kurt talked about this in the IRB meeting that he came in and talked about having the more important questions first, the demographic questions at the end. I think there's a little bit of tension in the academic world about how you design surveys. I've seen discussion, and it was in the textbook too, that some suggest doing the demographic ones first because it kind of eases them into more difficult questions. Some say to put the ones that will hook your audience in up front. I think the general rule of thumb is know your research and your research population, and don't ever put as your like first question something that is going to be completely overwhelming or significant. So if you are trying to figure out the impact that, let's say, childhood trauma had on an individual, you might not want to start with the question of what types of abuse did you experience. Might be a little overwhelming, might make people shut down, might make them anxious for the rest of the questions. So you want to have a good rhythm. I think it's also helpful to have a good flow. So your questions make logical sense. So if you're asking about housing, ask all your housing questions together in order versus jumping from housing to finances to housing to mental health to housing again. Make sure there's a logical flow. Watching out for floaters. So our textbook talked about the floaters. Those are kind of the people, or like the fence sitters. I think I meant to say fence sitters there. The fence sitters are the ones who are kind of gravitate towards the middle of the road on the scaling question. So if you're asking for a scale from 1 to 5, where do you fit? And that third one is kind of neutral. You don't really agree or strongly agree. You don't disagree or strongly disagree. People who they might have an opinion, but they don't feel maybe comfortable sharing it. It's controversial, or they just aren't. They feel safer picking the middle of the road questions. I think it might be helpful when doing the scaling questions is to have only a 4-point scale because it eliminates the neutral one. Again, there's pros and cons to that, but it might be helpful to eliminate some of that neutral response. And then finally, just when you're making your survey questions, you want to make sure they're clear and succinct. Don't use very verbose and wordy language. You want to just stay clear to exactly what you want the respondent to say. Make sure the questions are relevant to your population that you're asking and the research question. Ask only one question at a time. We don't want to do those double questions where the respondent doesn't know which one they're responding to. So you don't want to ask them, do you like pina coladas and getting caught up in the rain? Well, what if I like pina coladas but don't like getting caught up in the rain? You want to make sure it's very clear and only one at a time. And then to kind of piggyback off that, you want to avoid the leading questions where you're planting the thought of what they should respond in their head. So like, you like to go to Meijer, don't you? Yes or no? Professor Hoffman's class is your favorite, right? Like, you don't want to lead them into the response. Also, don't do the double negative. So that's like asking like, I do not support not changing My mind is blanking. The textbook had a really good example, and I'm totally blanking on it. It gets to be confusing language when you use the double negatives. I forgot to add this to the slide, but I do want to add this in here. If you were to be doing survey administration to individuals face to face or over the phone where you're reading them the question, you always want to make sure you're reading the question and explaining and reading the responses exactly as they are written on paper. This gets a little tricky if a client asks you to better explain the question because they don't understand it. Well, you want to help them, but you also don't want to explain it in a way that might change the meaning of the question or put a bias in there or have them interpret the question in a different way that someone else is reading it. So it's always a good rule of thumb when you're verbally giving a survey question, just reading it verbatim from the page. If the client asked you to better explain it, just keep going back to being like, well, I just need you to answer how you believe or how you're understanding it as is. You don't want to put those explanation biases in. All right, that's 15 minutes of surveys. Hopefully that was helpful, and we'll continue to rock and roll.